Black parent and child reunite after 20-year search. Where were you? Mariah shouted, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her face. The restaurant had gone completely silent, dozens of patrons frozen mid-bite, watching the confrontation unfold. 20 years, I wondered if you were even alive. James stood there, his weathered hands trembling, mouth opening and closing without sound. The elegant anniversary celebration around them faded into background noise as father and daughter faced each other for the first time in 2 decades. I wrote you letters, James finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I called the agency every week for years. They told me you didn't want to be found. Mariah's face contorted with confusion. What letters? What agency? I was told you abandoned us, that you walked out and never looked back. James took a halting step forward, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. Who told you that? Who would say such a thing? The restaurant manager approached cautiously. Sir, ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you. I'll leave, Mariah snapped, grabbing her purse. I've waited 20 years for answers. I guess I can wait a little longer. She turned to go, her shoulders rigid with decades of hurt. Please, James called after her, his voice breaking. Please don't go, not again. Mariah froze, her hand on the door. The weight of 20 years hung in the air between them. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when James Wilson was preparing for what he thought would be a quiet evening celebrating an old friend's anniversary. James Wilson straightened his tie in the mirror, the dark blue fabric a stark contrast against his crisp white shirt. At 67, his once jet-black hair had given way to distinguished silver, but he stood tall and proud, the result of 30 years of military discipline. His apartment was modest but immaculate, everything in its place, just as he liked it. The television murmured in the background, a PBS documentary about the civil rights movement. Images of the 1968 protests flickered across the screen, stirring memories from his youth. James had been just 10 years old then, holding his father's hand as they marched in Montgomery. Those were different times, hard times, but there had been such hope too. The phone rang, cutting through his thoughts. Thomas Brown's name flashed on the caller ID. James, you better not be thinking about backing out, Thomas boomed through the speaker. Even at 72, Thomas had the energy of a man half his age. Wouldn't dream of it, James replied with a chuckle. 40 years of marriage deserves a celebration. Alina would never forgive me if I missed it. Damn right she wouldn't, Thomas laughed. You know Alina still keeps me in line after all these years. James smiled, though there was a familiar ache in his chest. He'd never found that kind of lasting love himself. There had been Sandra, of course, but their time together had been cut tragically short, and after losing both Sandra and Mariah, he'd never found the courage to try again. I'll see you at 7, James said, ending the call. He walked to his bedroom and opened the top drawer of his dresser. Beneath carefully folded handkerchiefs lay a small velvet box. Inside was a silver locket, the one gift he'd been saving for 20 years. For Mariah, his daughter. James traced the engraved letter M with his fingertip. Today wasn't about him or his loss, he reminded himself. Today was for Thomas and Alina. He tucked the box into his jacket pocket anyway, a habit he couldn't break. He'd carried it to every significant event for the past 2 decades, just in case. Just in case today was the day he'd finally find her. Across town, Mariah Carter was running late. At 42, she'd built a successful career as a pediatric nurse, and her reputation for going above and beyond for her young patients was well-earned. Today had been particularly challenging, a new admission, a 7-year-old with leukemia who reminded her too much of herself at that age. Dr. Phillips, I'm heading out now, she called to the physician reviewing charts at the nurse's station. Remember, Jamie in room 304 needs his pain meds at 8, not 9. The night nurse has been briefed. Dr. Phillips looked up with a smile. Always taking care of everyone, Mariah. Don't worry, we've got this. Enjoy your evening off, those are rare enough. Mariah nodded, gathering her things. She hadn't wanted to attend this anniversary dinner. Large social gatherings always made her uncomfortable, but her adoptive mother, Patricia, had insisted. Alina was my roommate in college, Patricia had reminded her during their weekly phone call. She's known you since you were a baby. Besides, it would do you good to get out, meet some new people. That last part was code for meet a nice man, something Patricia had been none too subtly pushing for years. Mariah had long since stopped explaining that her work and her volunteer activities filled her life quite adequately. Some voids couldn't be filled by a relationship anyway. In her car, Mariah checked her appearance in the rearview mirror. Her dark brown skin glowed with a light application of makeup, and she'd taken extra care with her hair, the natural curls framing her face softly. The emerald green dress was new, purchased specifically for this occasion. You can do this, she told her reflection. 2 hours, tops, then home to that new mystery novel and a glass of wine. She pulled out of the hospital parking lot, unaware that this evening would change everything she thought she knew about herself and her past. The Grand Meridian restaurant was St. Louis' premier dining establishment, all crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths. Thomas had spared no expense for his and Alina's anniversary celebration, booking the entire mezzanine level for their 60 closest friends. James arrived precisely at 7, making his way through the crowded main floor to the private elevator. The maitre d' checked his name against the guest list with a practiced smile. Mr. Wilson, welcome. Mr. and Mrs. Brown are already upstairs greeting guests. When the elevator doors opened on the mezzanine level, James was immediately enveloped in the warm atmosphere of celebration. Thomas spotted him immediately, waving him over to where he stood with Alina. James. About time you showed up, Thomas said, pulling him into a bear hug. Alina, elegant in a champagne-colored dress, her silver hair swept up in a sophisticated knot, embraced him next. James, darling, you look wonderful. Not half as wonderful as you, James replied sincerely. 40 years and you're still the most beautiful woman in the room. Thomas doesn't deserve you. Don't I know it? Thomas agreed good-naturedly, his arm around his wife's waist. James handed them a small, wrapped package. It's not much, but I saw it and thought of you both. Alina unwrapped it carefully to reveal a vintage vinyl record, The Temptations, My Girl. Our wedding song, she whispered, visibly touched. Oh, James, you remembered. How could I forget? You two danced to it at every party for a decade, drove us all crazy, James teased. Thomas laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. Come on, let's get you a drink. I've got some people I want you to meet. As James followed his old friend to the bar, he scanned the room out of habit. After 20 years of searching for Mariah in every crowd, it had become automatic. The rational part of him knew she wouldn't be here. What were the chances? But he couldn't help himself. Scotch, neat, Thomas told the bartender, then turned to James. Same for you? James nodded, still distracted. Thomas, who's that woman talking to Alina, the one in the green dress? Thomas squinted across the room. Don't know her name. Friend of Alina's college roommate, I think. Why, she catch your eye, old man? He added with a wink. James didn't answer. There was something about her, something in the way she held herself, in the shape of her face. His heart began to pound. James, you all right? You've gone pale. I'm fine, James said automatically, accepting the scotch with a slightly trembling hand. Just reminded me of someone. Thomas gave him a knowing look. Sandra? No, James said quietly. Mariah. Thomas's expression softened. Few people knew about James's decades-long search for his daughter. Thomas was one of the few who understood what that loss had done to his friend. James, he said gently, don't do this to yourself tonight. Not every young woman is— I know, James cut him off. I know, you're right, but he couldn't take his eyes off her. Mariah sipped her champagne, nodding politely as Alina's friend Patricia chatted about her recent cruise to Alaska. She'd arrived late, slipping in during the first toast, and had been caught in a series of introductions ever since. And you must meet James, Alina was saying, guiding her across the room. He's Thomas's oldest friend. They served together in Vietnam. Such a dear man, though he's had more than his share of heartbreak. Mariah smiled automatically, allowing herself to be led toward the bar where two older men stood talking. One was clearly Thomas, whom she recognized from photos in Patricia's apartment. The other man had his back to them, but something about his posture, military straight, made her pause. A strange feeling washed over her, like déjà vu but stronger. She'd experienced this sensation before, usually before something significant happened with one of her patients. A sixth sense, Patricia called it. Thomas, James, Alina called. I'd like you to meet Mariah Carter, Patricia's adopted daughter. She's a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital. Thomas turned with a broad smile, but it was the other man's reaction that caught Mariah's attention. He went completely still, the color draining from his face as he stared at her. Mariah, he said, her name coming out like a prayer. Something electric shot through her at the sound of his voice. A memory buried deep, a man's voice singing softly. My girl, talking about my girl. I'm sorry, she said, extending her hand automatically. Have we met before? The man, James, seemed unable to speak for a moment. When he finally took her hand, his touch was gentle, almost reverent. I don't think so, he managed. I would have remembered. An awkward silence fell. Thomas cleared his throat. James Wilson was just telling me about his latest restoration project. He rebuilds classic cars, he explained to Mariah. Just finished a '67 Mustang. My father had a Mustang, Mariah said without thinking. At least, I think he did. Red with a black interior. James's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. I'm so sorry. he said, looking mortified as a waiter rushed over with a towel. No harm done, Elena assured him. Mariah, why don't you and James find your seats? We'll be starting dinner soon. As they walked toward the tables, Mariah felt James watching her, his gaze intense. It should have made her uncomfortable, but instead it stirred something like remembering a dream upon waking. You said your father had a Mustang, James said carefully as they found their place cards. Is he here tonight? Mariah shook her head. I never knew my biological father. I was adopted when I was around 5 after my mother died. James's breath caught. I'm sorry to hear that about your mother. Thank you, Mariah said, studying him more closely. There was something familiar about his eyes, deep brown with flecks of amber. Mr. Wilson, are you sure we haven't met? You seem familiar somehow. James hesitated, conflict evident on his face. I don't know, he said finally, but I'd like to know more about you if that's not too forward. Before Mariah could respond, a tinkling of glass announced the start of dinner. As everyone took their seats, she found herself seated directly across from James, an arrangement that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. Throughout the first course, a creamy mushroom soup, Mariah felt James's gaze returning to her again and again. Each time she looked up, he would quickly look away, focusing intently on his soup. I hope I'm not making you uncomfortable, he said finally, his voice low. No, Mariah replied honestly. Just curious. You remind me of someone too, but I can't place who. James seemed to make a decision. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. I've carried this with me for 20 years, he said, placing it on the table between them. I'd like you to see what's inside. Mariah looked at the box, then back at James. Slowly, she reached for it. Inside was a silver locket, delicate and clearly antique. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it out. Open it, James urged softly. Mariah clicked the tiny clasp. Inside was a miniature photograph of a young woman holding a little girl of about 4. The woman was beautiful, with a wide smile and the same deep brown eyes as Mariah herself. The little girl was beaming at the camera, missing her 2 front teeth. Mariah couldn't breathe. She knew that photograph. She'd seen it before in a dream, in a memory. This is, she began but couldn't finish. Sandra, James said, his voice thick with emotion. My wife and our daughter, Mariah, you. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mariah stared at the man across the table, at his eyes, her eyes, and felt the ground falling away beneath her. That's not possible, she whispered. My father abandoned us. He left when I was a baby. James shook his head, pain etched in every line of his face. No, never. I was deployed when Sandra got sick. By the time I made it home, she was gone, and so were you. They told me you'd been placed in foster care and then adopted. I've been searching for you ever since. Mariah's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now, surrounded by strangers celebrating a milestone she could barely comprehend. I need some air, she said abruptly, rising from her table. James half stood, concern etched on his face. Mariah, please, she said, holding up a hand. Just give me a minute. She made her way to the terrace, aware of the curious glances following her. Outside, the cool evening air helped clear her head. She clutched the locket in her palm, its metal warm against her skin. Could it be true? Could this man really be her father? The father she'd been told had abandoned them, who hadn't wanted the responsibility of a child. The terrace door opened behind her. She expected James, but it was Patricia who stepped out, concern in her eyes. Mariah, are you all right? Elena said you left the table suddenly. Mariah turned to the woman who had raised her, who had been her mother in every way that mattered for most of her life. Did you know? She asked, her voice surprisingly steady. Patricia's expression shifted from concern to confusion. Know what, dear? Mariah held out the locket. That my father has been looking for me, that he never abandoned us. Patricia took the locket, her face paling as she recognized the photograph inside. Where did you get this? From James Wilson. The man sitting across from me at dinner. He says he's my father. Patricia sank onto a nearby bench, her hand at her throat. Oh my God, James Wilson, the name on your original birth certificate. So it's true, Mariah demanded, her composure beginning to crack. He really is my father, Patricia nodded slowly. I don't know about him searching for you. The adoption agency told me your father had relinquished all parental rights after your mother died, that he couldn't care for you alone. He says that's a lie, that he came back from deployment to find Mom dead and me gone, that he's been looking for me for 20 years. The implications of this hit Mariah like a physical blow. 20 years of believing she'd been unwanted, abandoned. 20 years of building walls around her heart, of never truly letting anyone close for fear they would leave too. I need to know the truth, she said, more to herself than to Patricia. I need to hear it all. Patricia stood, taking Mariah's hands in hers. Then let's go talk to him together. They re-entered the restaurant just as the main course was being served. James looked up as they approached, hope and fear warring in his expression. Mr. Wilson, Patricia said formally, I'm Patricia Carter, Mariah's adoptive mother. James rose to his feet, extending his hand. Mrs. Carter. Thank you for raising my daughter when I couldn't. The simple sincerity in his voice brought tears to Mariah's eyes. This wasn't the reaction of a man who had willingly given up his child. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private, Patricia suggested, glancing around at the curious onlookers. Thomas appeared at James's elbow. Take my office, he offered, gesturing to a door at the far end of the mezzanine. It's quiet and no one will disturb you there. As the three of them walked toward the office, Mariah felt as though she were moving through a dream. Around them, the anniversary celebration continued, glasses clinking, laughter rising and falling, while her entire world shifted on its foundation. Thomas's office was warmly lit and comfortably furnished, with photographs covering one wall. Thomas and Alina through the years, their children, grandchildren, a life fully lived and documented. James sat across from Mariah and Patricia, his hands clasped tightly before him. I don't know where to begin, he admitted. The beginning, Mariah said simply. Tell me everything, James nodded, taking a deep breath. I met your mother in 1978. I was stationed at Fort Leonard Wood, and she was working as a nurse at the base hospital. It was love at first sight, at least for me. A small smile touched his lips at the memory. Sandra made me work a bit harder for it. She was beautiful, Mariah said softly, looking down at the locket she still held. Yes, inside and out. We married in 1980 and you came along in 1982. Perfect little girl right from the start. His voice caught. We were happy, so happy, but in '87 I got deployed to Panama, Operation Just Cause. I was supposed to be gone 6 months. His expression darkened. 3 months in, I got word that Sandra was sick, cancer. It had spread quickly. I applied for compassionate leave, but by the time the paperwork went through, he swallowed hard. By the time I got home, she was gone, and so were you. What do you mean, gone? Patricia asked gently. The neighbor who'd been looking after Mariah said a social worker had come and taken her into care. With no next of kin available and me still officially deployed, they'd placed her in emergency foster care. James's hands clenched. I went to the agency right away, showed them my ID, my papers proving I was her father. They said I'd need to apply for custody, that there was a process. And did you? Mariah asked, hardly daring to breathe. Of course I did. Every form, every interview, every home inspection. I did it all. Tears welled in his eyes. Then they told me you'd been placed with a family, that the adoption was being finalized, that it would be disruptive to remove you. Patricia gasped softly. They never told me there was a father actively seeking custody. They said you had signed away your rights. James shook his head vehemently. Never, I would never. I hired a lawyer, filed appeals, but the records were sealed and your new name. He looked at Mariah with such longing it made her chest ache. They wouldn't tell me anything. So how did you know it was me? Mariah asked. Tonight, I mean, how could you be sure? James smiled sadly. Your eyes, they're Sandra's eyes, and when you mentioned the Mustang. That sealed it, red with black interior. I used to take you for drives on Sundays. You called it the Zoom Zoom car. The phrase unlocked something in Mariah's memory, sitting on her father's lap, tiny hands on the steering wheel, giggling as he made engine noises. Zoom Zoom, she whispered. James nodded, tears flowing freely now. I never stopped looking. Every year on your birthday, I'd place an ad in newspapers across the country. Mariah Wilson, born March 15, 1982. Your father is looking for you. I registered with every reunion database, hired private investigators. I never saw any ads, Mariah said, turning to Patricia. Did you? Patricia shook her head. No, and I wouldn't have hidden them from you if I had. You know I've always supported your right to know your origins. That's why I kept your first name, why I showed you the few photos I had of your birth mother. But not my father, Mariah said, a hint of accusation in her voice. I didn't have any, Patricia said apologetically. The agency only provided information about Sandra. They said your father was out of the picture. James reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted a worn photograph and handed it to Mariah. It showed a younger version of himself in uniform, holding a toddler Mariah on his shoulders. Both were laughing. I've carried this every day for 40 years, he said quietly. Something inside Mariah broke open, a dam holding back memories she hadn't known she possessed. The smell of her father's aftershave, the scratch of his uniform against her cheek when he hugged her, his deep voice singing her to sleep. Daddy, she whispered, the word feeling both foreign and achingly familiar on her tongue. James's face crumpled at the word. I never stopped looking, he repeated. Never stopped hoping. Patricia reached over and squeezed Mariah's hand. I think, she said gently, that you two have a lot of catching up to do. Perhaps I should give you some privacy. As she rose to leave, Mariah caught her hand. "Stay," she said. "Please, you're my mother too. I need you both here." Patricia sat back down, visibly moved. James looked between them, then nodded in understanding. "Mrs. Carter," he said sincerely, "I can never thank you enough for raising Mariah, for giving her the love and stability I couldn't." "Patricia, please," she insisted. "And there's no need for thanks. Mariah has been the greatest joy of my life." She smiled at her daughter. "Though I think she deserves to know the rest of your story too, James, the last 20 years of your life." James nodded. "Not much to tell, really. After the military, I settled here in St. Louis, kept it as my home base because this is where Sandra and I lived, where you were born," he told Mariah. "I worked as a mechanic, specializing in classic car restoration. Kept to myself mostly, focused on the search." "No other family?" Mariah asked. James shook his head. "My parents passed away before you were born. I was an only child after losing you and Sandra," he shrugged. "Thomas and Alina were about the only people who could get me out of the house." "Thank God they did," Mariah said softly, "or we might never have found each other." James looked at her, wonder and gratitude in his expression. Would it be all right if I hugged you?" Mariah nodded, her throat too tight for words. She stood, and then her father's arms were around her, strong, secure, familiar in a way that defied explanation. She breathed in his scent, and more memories surfaced. Sitting on his shoulders at a parade, him teaching her to tie her shoes, the safe feeling of being carried to bed after falling asleep in the car. When they finally separated, both wiping away tears, Patricia was smiling through her own tears. "Think," she said, "that this calls for a celebration of its own. Shall we rejoin the party? I believe they're about to serve dessert." James looked uncertain. "Are you sure? We don't have to." "I'm sure," Mariah said firmly. "I want everyone to know I found my father, that we found each other." As they returned to the main room, Thomas caught James's eye from across the space, raising an eyebrow in question. James nodded, a smile breaking across his face like sunrise. Thomas's whoop of joy drew everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas announced, raising his glass. "I know this is supposed to be Alina's and my celebration, but I hope you'll indulge me in marking another momentous occasion. My dear friend James has just been reunited with his daughter after 20 years apart." A murmur of surprise and delight spread through the room, followed by spontaneous applause. Alina rushed over, embracing first James, then Mariah. "I knew it," she said, beaming. "I saw how he looked at you, and I just knew." "Oh, James, I'm so happy for you both." As waiters circulated with champagne, Mariah found herself at the center of attention, a position she normally avoided at all costs. But with her father beside her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, she found she didn't mind. "A toast," Thomas called out. "To James and Mariah, proof that some bonds can never be broken, no matter how much time passes. To reunion." "To reunion," the crowd echoed, raising their glasses. Mariah turned to her father, clinking her glass against his. "To new beginnings," she added softly. James's smile was like coming home. "To new beginnings," he agreed. As the evening wound down, Mariah, James, and Patricia sat at a corner table, sharing stories that filled in the missing years. Patricia had brought photo albums to the event. "Always prepared," she'd said with a wink, and James pored over them, drinking in the sight of his daughter growing up. "Your first day of school," he murmured, touching a photo of a gap-toothed Mariah in a plaid jumper. "Your high school graduation, college." He looked up at Patricia. "Thank you for documenting everything so beautifully." "I always hoped she might want to share these with her birth family someday," Patricia admitted. "I just never imagined it would happen like this." James turned the page to find a news clipping. "Mariah Carter receives Nursing Excellence Award." The headline read, above a photo of Mariah in her nurse's uniform accepting a plaque. "You followed in your mother's footsteps," James said, his voice thick with emotion. Mariah nodded. "I always felt drawn to nursing, especially pediatrics. Now I understand why." "Sandra would be so proud," James said. "So very proud." "Tell me more about her," Mariah urged. "I have so few memories." James's expression softened. "She was extraordinary. Brilliant, compassionate. She could light up a room just by walking into it. And stubborn, my God, was she stubborn. You get that from her." "I do not," Mariah protested automatically, then laughed at herself. "Okay, maybe a little." "She loved music," James continued. "Especially Motown, The Temptations, Marvin Gaye, Diana Ross. She'd dance with you in the kitchen while making dinner, twirling you around until you were both dizzy." "I remember that," Mariah said softly. "At least, I think I do. The feeling of it anyway." "Your memory is remarkable," Patricia commented. "Most people don't retain much from before age 5. Trauma can cement certain memories," James said quietly. "Losing her mother, being taken from her home, those aren't things easily forgotten, even by a child." Mariah reached across the table, taking his hand. "I remembered you," she said. Not consciously, perhaps, but when I saw you tonight, something inside me recognized you immediately. James squeezed her hand, unable to speak for a moment. The restaurant manager approached their table apologetically. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we'll be closing soon. Of course, Patricia said, gathering her things. It's gotten quite late. Outside, the night air was cool and clear, stars visible despite the city lights. They stood together on the sidewalk, reluctant to part. I live just a few blocks from here, James said. Would you like to come see my place, if it's not too late, I mean? I'd like that, Mariah said without hesitation. She turned to Patricia. Would you like to come too? Patricia shook her head with a smile. No, dear, this is your time together. We can all meet for brunch tomorrow, perhaps. I'd like that very much, James said sincerely. After exchanging phone numbers and arranging to meet the next day, Patricia hugged Mariah tightly. I'm so happy for you, she whispered. This is everything I ever wished for you. Thank you, Mariah whispered back, for everything. As Patricia's taxi pulled away, Mariah and James began walking toward his apartment, a comfortable silence between them. I'm not sure what the protocol is, James admitted finally. For getting to know your adult daughter after 20 years apart, Mariah smiled. I don't think there is one. We'll figure it out as we go. James's apartment building was an old converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and large windows. His unit was on the 4th floor, and as he unlocked the door, he suddenly looked nervous. It's not much, he warned. Bachelor living. But when he switched on the lights, Mariah gasped in delight. The space was beautiful, open, and warm, with hardwood floors and comfortable furniture. One wall was lined with bookshelves, another with framed maps and photographs. A record player sat in one corner beside a collection of vinyl that would make any collector envious. This is lovely, she said sincerely. James relaxed visibly. Make yourself at home. Would you like some tea, coffee? Tea would be nice, Mariah said, gravitating toward the bookshelves. James's collection was eclectic: history, biographies, photography books, classic literature. You're a reader, she commented as he put the kettle on. Always have been, he called from the kitchen. You too, from what Patricia showed me in those albums. Always, Mariah confirmed, smiling as she spotted a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, her own favorite. A framed photograph on the shelf caught her eye, a military unit, James standing proud in the front row. Next to it was another frame, this one holding what appeared to be a letter. Looking closer, Mariah realized it was addressed to her. Mariah Wilson, CO St. Louis Post-Dispatch Personals, it read. If you were born on March 15, 1982, please contact James Wilson. Your father is looking for you. I placed one every year, James said quietly, having come up behind her. In major newspapers across the country, always on your birthday. Mariah turned to him, her heart breaking anew at the decades of longing evident in his eyes. I never saw them, she said softly. I'm so sorry. James shook his head. Don't be sorry, you're here now, that's all that matters. The kettle whistled, and he returned to the kitchen. Mariah continued exploring, her attention caught by a door left slightly ajar. Curious, she pushed it open to find what was clearly a guest bedroom, but one decorated for a much younger person. The walls were painted a soft yellow with a border of butterflies running along the ceiling. A bookshelf held children's classics, Charlotte's Web, The Secret Garden, A Wrinkle in Time. On the dresser sat a collection of snow globes, and above it hung a handmade quilt in cheerful primary colors. I kept hoping, James said from the doorway, 2 mugs of tea in his hands. That somehow, someday, I'd find you, that you might want a visit to stay over sometimes. He looked embarrassed. The room grew up as I imagined you growing up. When you would have been 10, I put away the stuffed animals and added the desk. At 15, I changed the paint color from pink to yellow because I figured a teenager wouldn't want a pink room. Mariah was speechless, overwhelmed by this physical evidence of his enduring love. A room that had waited for her, evolved for her, even as she'd grown up not knowing he existed. The quilt, she managed finally. It's beautiful. I made it, James admitted. Took a class at the community center, figured it was something a father could give his daughter no matter her age. Mariah crossed to him, taking one of the mugs, and then, after a moment's hesitation, leaning up to kiss his cheek. Thank you, she said simply, for never giving up on me. They moved to the living room, sitting on the comfortable sofa. For a while they just talked about their lives, their work, their interests. James was easy to talk to, his attention fully focused on her every word. Mariah found herself relaxing, the initial shock and disorientation giving way to a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. I've been collecting things for you, James said suddenly, setting down his empty mug. Over the years, would you like to see? At Mariah's nod, he disappeared into his bedroom, returning with a large wooden box. He set it on the coffee table and opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of items, each one carefully preserved. Mariah's baby shoes, a lock of her hair tied with a faded ribbon, her birth certificate, a tiny hospital bracelet. There were drawings she'd made as a toddler, a report card from kindergarten, photographs documenting her first steps, first birthday, first words. How did you save all this? Mariah asked, amazed. I took everything I could when I went to look for you, James explained. Everything that would fit in my duffel bag, the rest furniture, toys I had to leave behind. But these, he touched the items reverently. These were the essence of you. I couldn't let them go. Mariah lifted out a small plush elephant, worn thin with age. Ellie, she breathed, recognizing it instantly. I used to dream about this elephant. I told Patricia about it once, but she said I'd never had a toy like that, at least not with her. You carried it everywhere, James confirmed. Wouldn't sleep without it. He hesitated, then added softly, it's yours if you want it back. Mariah hugged the elephant to her chest. I'd like that very much. They continued through the box, each item unlocking more memories for Mariah, the taste of the butter cookies her mother would make, the sound of her father's work boots on the porch steps, the feel of his uniform jacket draped around her shoulders when she got cold at a 4th of July fireworks display. It's like finding pieces of myself I didn't know were missing, she said wonderingly. James nodded in understanding. For 20 years I've been half a person, he admitted, the father of a lost child. Now I can finally be whole again. He paused, then asked the question that clearly weighed on him. Can you forgive me for not finding you sooner? There's nothing to forgive, Mariah said firmly. You never stopped looking, and I'm the one who should apologize. All these years I thought you'd abandoned us. I was angry at you, resentful. You had every right to be based on what you were told, James assured her. What matters is that we know the truth now. They talked through the night, neither willing to end this precious reunion. As dawn broke, they were still there on the sofa, surrounded by the artifacts of Mariah's early childhood, building a bridge between past and present. We should get some rest, James said finally, noticing Mariah stifling a yawn. We're meeting Patricia for brunch in a few hours. You're right, Mariah agreed reluctantly. I should go home, change clothes. Or, James suggested hesitantly, you could stay here, use the guest room, your room. If you want to, Mariah smiled. I'd like that. As James showed her to the yellow room, providing a new toothbrush and a clean t-shirt to sleep in, Mariah felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The room that had waited so patiently for her presence finally had its rightful occupant. Sleep well, James said, lingering in the doorway. I'll be just down the hall if you need anything. Dad, Mariah said, testing the word again. It felt right. Thank you for everything. James's smile was radiant. Having you call me Dad again is thanks enough, he said softly. More than enough. After he left, closing the door behind him, Mariah lay in the bed that had been prepared for her across decades. She clutched Ellie the elephant to her chest, breathing in the faint scent of her childhood. Outside, the city was waking up, traffic beginning to hum, birds greeting the morning. A new day, a new beginning. After 20 years of separation, Mariah Wilson had found her way home. Now back to where we started. Please, James called after her, his voice breaking. Please don't go, not again. Mariah froze, her hand on the door. The weight of 20 years hung in the air between them. Slowly, she turned back to face him. The restaurant was still silent, every eye on their unfolding drama. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice barely audible. When we met at the anniversary party, when we spent the night talking, when we had brunch with Patricia the next day. It's been 3 weeks and you never said a word about her. James looked stricken. I was going to tell you, I didn't want to overwhelm you with everything at once. We were just getting to know each other again. So you let me find out like this, from a stranger at a hospital fundraiser. Mariah gestured to the woman standing uncomfortably nearby. Do you know what it felt like to have someone come up to me and say, oh, you must be James Wilson's daughter? I'm so sorry about your sister, such a tragedy. James took a step toward her. Mariah, please let me explain. Explain what? That I had a twin sister, that she died while I lived, that this, she held up the locket he'd given her, now containing both their childhood photos, this wasn't just mine, that the room you kept for me, the things you saved, they were for both of us. Yes, James said simply. All of that, please just sit down, let me tell you about Rebecca. For a moment, Mariah remained frozen, poised between flight and forgiveness. Then slowly she returned to the table. The other diners, sensing the crisis had passed, gradually returned to their own conversations, though many still cast curious glances their way. I'm listening, Mariah said, her voice steady despite the tears still streaming down her face. James took a deep breath. You were twins, identical in every way except a small birthmark Rebecca had on her left wrist. You were born 4 minutes apart, you first, then her. Why didn't Patricia know? Why wasn't she told? Rebecca died before you both went into foster care, James said, his voice catching. Leukemia, the same disease that took your mother, she was diagnosed just after Sandra. By the time I got home from deployment, she was already gone too. Mariah sat back, stunned. So when the social worker came, they only took you, James confirmed. One daughter, not two. The paperwork reflected that. I think that's why the adoption went through so quickly. They didn't realize I'd lost my wife and one daughter and was desperately trying to keep from losing the other one too. All this time, Mariah whispered. All those dreams I had of another little girl, I thought I was imagining things. James reached across the table, taking her hand. You weren't. You and Rebecca were inseparable. You shared a room, clothes, toys. You even had your own twin language that drove your mother crazy because we couldn't understand half of what you were saying to each other. But why keep it from me? These past 3 weeks, as we've been getting to know each other again, why not tell me about her? James's expression was pained. Because losing Rebecca nearly destroyed me, and then losing you. He shook his head. I was afraid that it would be too much for you to absorb all at once. Afraid that you might withdraw from me if you knew the full scope of the tragedy, and selfishly afraid to revisit that pain myself. Mariah was quiet for a long moment, processing this new revelation. Do you have pictures of us together? James nodded. Many in the box at home. He hesitated. I couldn't bring myself to show them to you yet. I'm so sorry, Mariah. I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning. Yes, she agreed, you should have. Then, seeing the fear in his eyes, she squeezed his hand. But I understand why you didn't. Relief washed over James's face. You do. Dad, Mariah said gently, I'm a pediatric oncology nurse. I work with dying children and their families every day. I know what that kind of loss does to a person, how it can make you build walls, try to protect yourself from further pain. James nodded, tears spilling down his weathered cheeks. It doesn't excuse my silence. No, Mariah agreed. But it makes it understandable. She paused, then asked, what was she like, Rebecca? A small smile touched James's lips. Fearless, where you were thoughtful and cautious, she was all impulse and adventure. You balanced each other perfectly. She was the one who convinced you to climb trees, and you were the one who made sure you both had band-aids in your pockets just in case. Mariah laughed softly. That sounds like me. You've kept that quality, James observed. The caretaker, the one who thinks ahead. It's what makes you such an excellent nurse. And what happened to Rebecca's things after she died? I donated most of them, James admitted. It was too painful to keep them all, but I saved the special things, her favorite stuffed animal, a panda named Poe, her baby blanket, the matching lockets your mother gave you both on your 4th birthday. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a second velvet box, identical to the one he'd given Mariah 3 weeks earlier. This was hers. I've been trying to find the right moment to give it to you. Mariah took the box, opening it to find a silver locket that matched her own. Inside was the same photo, Sandra with her twin daughters, but this one focused more on Rebecca. They're the family you lost, Mariah said softly, mother and daughter. And you're the family I found again, James replied. My miracle. Mariah closed the locket, clutching both boxes in her hand. I want to know everything about her, about us. No more secrets, Dad. Promise me? I promise, James said solemnly. Everything I remember, everything I know, it's all yours. The restaurant manager approached again, more hesitantly this time. I'm very sorry to interrupt, but we do need to close soon. Of course, James said, signaling for the check. To Mariah, he added, Would you like to come back to the apartment? I can show you Rebecca's things. Mariah nodded. I'd like that very much. As they walked together through the quiet streets, arms linked, Mariah felt the weight of the 2 lockets in her pocket. One for the sister she'd lost, one for the self she was reclaiming. There would be more revelations, she knew, more adjustments as she integrated this new knowledge into her understanding of herself. But she also knew that she wasn't facing it alone. Her father walked beside her, solid and real after 20 years of absence. Behind them, Patricia waited with her unconditional support. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirits of her mother and sister watched over them, celebrating this long-awaited reunion. You know, James said as they turned onto his street, Rebecca would have loved you, the woman you've become. Tell me more about her, Mariah requested. Everything you can remember. And as they climbed the stairs to his apartment, James began to share the stories he'd held close for decades, stories of 2 little girls who were mirror images of each other, who shared a bond that even death couldn't fully sever. In the yellow room that night, Mariah placed both lockets on the bedside table, open to show the faces inside. Mother, father, sisters, family. After 20 years of feeling incomplete without knowing why, Mariah Wilson finally understood the source of that emptiness. And though it could never be fully filled, the spaces left by her mother and sister would always remain. She was no longer alone in carrying their memory. As she drifted off to sleep, Ellie the elephant clutched to her chest. She whispered into the darkness, "I remember you now, Rebecca, and I won't forget again." If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. Outside her window, a star seemed to shine just a little brighter in response. 1 year later, the cemetery was peaceful in the early morning light, dew glistening on the grass between the headstones. James and Mariah walked slowly along the path, a bouquet of white roses in Mariah's arms. "It's just up ahead," James said, gesturing to a small hill crowned with an oak tree. "Under the tree." They climbed the gentle slope together, Mariah's arm linked through her father's. At the top, beneath the spreading branches of the ancient oak, stood 2 matching headstones. Sandra Wilson, 1958-1987, beloved wife and mother, love never ends. Rebecca Wilson, 1982-1987, cherished daughter and sister, forever in our hearts. Mariah knelt between the graves, dividing the roses equally between them. "Hello, Mom," she said softly. "Hello, Rebecca. Dad and I are here." James stood behind her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. In the year since their reunion, they had built a relationship stronger than either could have imagined possible. Mariah had moved into the yellow room for a few months while looking for a new apartment, and they had established a comfortable routine: Sunday dinners, weekly phone calls, surprise visits to each other's workplaces. Patricia had become part of their extended family as well, joining them for holidays and special occasions. Just last month, she and James had co-hosted Mariah's 43rd birthday party, the first real celebration of her birth since she was a child. "I think they would be proud of us," James said, gazing at the headstones. "Of how far we've come." Mariah nodded, rising to stand beside him. "I think so too." She touched the locket at her throat, her mother's gift, now restored to its rightful owner. In her pocket was the second locket, Rebecca's, which she carried with her always. "I've been thinking," she said as they made their way back down the hill, "about the foundation." The Rebecca Wilson Memorial Foundation had been James's idea, a charity to support families of children with leukemia. Mariah had enthusiastically embraced the concept, leveraging her connections in the medical community to get it off the ground. "What about it?" James asked. "I think we should expand it. Not just financial support for families, but a scholarship program for nursing students specializing in pediatric oncology." James smiled. "Your mother would love that, using her legacy to train the next generation of nurses." "And I was thinking," Mariah continued, "about taking a sabbatical from the hospital just for a year to focus on getting the foundation established properly." "Are you sure you love your work?" "I do," Mariah agreed. "But this is important too, and—" She hesitated. "I thought maybe we could use the time to find the social worker, the one who took me from our home. I want to understand what really happened." James was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. "I think that's a good idea. It's time we had the full truth." They reached the car, but before getting in, Mariah turned to look back at the oak tree on the hill, its leaves golden in the autumn sunlight. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "for most of my life I felt like something was missing. Like I was searching for a piece of myself I couldn't name." "And now?" James asked. Mariah smiled, the peace in her expression mirroring the serenity of the cemetery around them. "Now I know what I was looking for, and even though I can never have it all back, Mom, Rebecca, those lost years with you, I've found something I didn't expect." "What's that?" "Wholeness," Mariah said simply. "The parts of me that were lost or hidden have been found, named, honored." She touched her locket again. "I carry them with me now, not as wounds, but as treasures." James wrapped his arm around his daughter's shoulders, drawing her close. "That," he said softly, "is the greatest gift I could have hoped for both of us." Together, they drove away from the cemetery, leaving the graves behind but carrying the spirits of their lost loved ones with them. The search that had consumed 20 years of their lives was over. In its place was something new, a future built on the foundation of a past reclaimed, a family reunited across time and loss and misunderstanding. And if there were still questions to be answered, mysteries to be solved, they would face them together, father and daughter, bound by blood and memory and the unbreakable love that had brought them back to each other after 20 years apart. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.